Shirley, thank you for being here and for your support. I'm so grateful. We are all grateful. Beautiful.
Well, thanks so much. The classes have been wonderful, all of them, really.
We got a great lineup coming for the year. Nobody's quite as awesome as Shai, but I will say, pretty good. So, Ria, I have to ask you something. I'm going to, uh, did you get my email, Ria, about June 4th? Ria, can you hear me?
When did you send which email? Is it the
Okay,
latest?
I'm gonna resend it to you, and I will, and so I'll call you after this class. We're already recording.
Oh, I have an appointment. I have to leave exactly at 11:15. So,
Okay. Will you call me when you're done with your appointment?
yes,
Remember that?
yes.
Okay. Thank you, my dear. Welcome,
Okay.
everybody. There is, I'm so happy to see Chuck. Good to see you, Chuck. And also my dad, Asher, and all of you. So happy you're here. Here's what's incredibly exciting about today. This is kind of new material for Rav Shai. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on with the Advanced Learning Institute is that we're kind of a laboratory because it's small and intimate. It's, not a university setting where people are ready to pounce on you or whatever. It's just an opportunity for great scholars to be able to work on new material with a very thoughtful, interesting audience who will ask good questions. And so we're thrilled to have you here. I want to say, as I always do, to everybody who makes these classes possible with your gifts, your donations. We are so grateful. We're going to continue them in perpetuity, please God. And we hope that we have a new season of wonderful learning together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rav Shai.
Thank you, Rabbi Marcia. It is so good to see you and to see your Jay Cookers. Do you call them Jay Cookers or Jay Cooknicks?
I don't know.
All right, we'll work on that. So, what Rabbi Marcia said is so true. This is the first time that I am putting together this particular set of ideas in this particular format. So some of the material is actually new to me, and I want to tell you a little bit about the background of my decision to go in this direction because one of the things that characterizes academics, which used to be my home, is that we know more and more about less and less, and that we really silo ourselves into very narrow spaces. And I am stepping into the world of history from the world of Jewish thought. And so, that is not altogether comfortable. Why am I doing that? Because of October 7th. So the book that I had planned on writing next before October 7th was um, Jewish thought, was theology, was Torah, was how can we bring an authentic, traditionally infused Judaism into the 21st century and have it be as meaningful for us as it has been for our grandparents and our great grandparents and our ancestors through the ages. But then October 7th happened, and it seemed to me that I was amongst a cadre of Jewish educators who has let our So I'm going to ask everybody if they can mute for now while I'm talking. And then if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. You can press the raise hand symbol, and I will absolutely get to you. Thank you. So I feel as though I am part of a generation of Jewish educators that has let our kids down. And it's not the idea of being on a college campus and supporting Palestinian rights that makes me say that. It is the idea that somehow Zionism is not a necessary and constituent element of Judaism. There is an ongoing concerted effort to put a wedge, to drive a wedge between Judaism and Zionism. And so, of course, these are two different things in that Judaism describes a religious civilization that goes back thousands of years, and Zionism describes a political movement that was founded in the late 19th century. And so there's overlap, but there's not identity. But the idea that these are separable, um, one can separate them if one so chooses, but to say that they're not organically connected, I think is a deep misreading of Jewish history and Jewish thought. And so what I want to do in the next book that I'm writing is called Reconfiguring the Covenant: People, Land, and Torah. And so for this week and the next 2 weeks, what I'm going to do with you is have a session on people, which is today's topic, land, and Torah. And so there's going to be lots of historical discussion of people, and then land and Torah, because if people decide that they feel as though their moral integrity demands a kind of separation from Israel, I can't speak to that directly and immediately. But if they're saying that there has not been a 2,000-year-old conflation of Judaism and the Jewish yearning to return to the land of Israel as the people of Israel, I can speak to that as a scholar. And I'm hoping that by the time I get to the end of this process, that we will be able to be both true to our moral convictions that have been informed by the Jewish tradition, and feel as though Zionism and Israel is absolutely central to our identity, no matter our posture toward Israel and Zionism. That was abstract. Let's get into it. So here we go. All right. So the first component of the covenant of the Brit is people. So the question is, after emancipation, what's left for the Jewish people? So I am going to assume that most people here didn't know up until this point more about Jewish history than I knew before I started researching it. If you do, and I'm telling you things that are old news, I apologize. I don't like it when people do it to me, and I don't want to do it to anybody else, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay. So what needs to be said is that regardless of the academic arm wrestling about when the Torah was written and when it became authoritative and who wrote it and which different groups of Judeans were responsible for which pieces, all that is interesting if you're interested in it. But what we know from history is that we were a people from the 13th century. And the evidence for that is in Cairo, Egypt, in the museum there. And this is Merneptah's stele. And you can see the sun god here, and right there, I think is the sun god. Maybe it's up here. It's for everyone to see. And at the very bottom of the exploits of talking about the military conquests of Merneptah, it says that Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Ha! I love reading that because ancient Egypt's seed is no more. We're doing, I don't know if we're doing great, but we have survived the ancient Egyptians. They claimed to have totally wiped us out. This is dated to 1208 BCE. That means two things. A, that we were a people, and B, It means that we were impressive enough, big enough, well known enough to brag about wiping out, right? You don't put on a monument like this that you eradicated some insignificant neighborhood, right? If you're going to brag like this is a bragging monument, then I would assume that Israel was well enough known in the area that for Merneptah to claim that he laid Israel waste at sea knows no more gave him some credibility. Okay, so we go back as a people to the 13th century. All right, I'm not using the Bible as a source of history because it is contested. And what I want to be able to give to the Jewish people are uncontested facts about history. So we know that there were two different kingdoms. There was a kingdom of Israel in the north, the 10 tribes of Israel, that's them. And then in the south, there was the kingdom of Judah. And that this red little strip that kind of looks like the Gaza Strip, but it's much bigger, was the Philistine kingdom. Okay. From 921 for 200 years, the kingdom of Israel was the big brother, was the big cousin. They were related to Judah in some ways. We're not exactly positive in what ways, but there were two different kingdoms. And in 721, the Assyrians, Sennacherib, came into the kingdom of Israel and wiped Israel out. Those 10 tribes the lost 10 tribes of Israel, they were dispersed all over the Assyrian kingdom. It's not that they didn't have a map or a compass and didn't know where they were. It's that they no longer had a corporate communal Israelite identity. So they were lost to the Israelite people. So those are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So the only thing that's left now from 721 forward is the kingdom of Judah. And we've got, again, lots of evidence from real archaeological monuments from the king of Moab. This is called the Mesha stele, and it talks about Ahab, the king of Israel, and Yehu, the king of Israel, and Yud-He Vav-He, right? The four-letter name of God is the God of the people of Israel. So we're not just making this stuff up in the Bible in the 2nd century, which is what some anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist scholars claim. The reason why I'm saying they're anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist is because I can't think of any other explanation for them to deny the ancient Judean and Israelite connection to the land other than wanting to undermine the contemporary Jewish claim to the land. This is what goes on in academia today. And so I'm not writing for other academics in this book, right? I'm writing for Jews and non-Jews who don't need to know about the academic arm wrestling around the high table of biblical criticism because it doesn't really matter. But this is archaeological history and it's irrefutable. Okay. Here is another one of these statues. We see the king of Israel bowing down and kissing the feet of the king of Assyria and bringing all kinds of tribute. Okay. So in 721, Sargon destroys the northern kingdom. They're distributed all over the Assyrian Empire. But in the process of all the Israelites from the northern kingdom of Israel going all over the place, some of them went down to Judea because they were like cousins. They seemed to worship the same God. They had the same language, which was Hebrew. And they found these scribes from Israel. They found a home in the Jerusalem priesthood, in the Jerusalem temple. And they started writing, from what we know, a history of the people. All right, so from 721 to 586, Everybody who had anything to do with the kingdom of Israel or Judea was now in geographically the kingdom of Judea. And we were a little tiny place. We had a temple, we had priests, but there were these huge empires. There was the Assyrian Empire and there was the Egyptian Empire, and we were caught in between. And so we tried to play one empire against another empire to give tribute so that they would protect us. And one of our kings made a mistake. I don't know if it would have made a difference or if it would have made a difference for how long it would have made a difference. But when the king said to Egypt, I want to be your friends here, we're going to give you tribute. So if we are attacked by anybody, but the people who are going to attack us are the Babylonians, we want you, the Egyptians, to come and protect us, which is kind of ironic given the history of our stories about having been slaves in Egypt. But Egypt said, sure, we'll take your tribute. And when Babylon invaded Judea, Egypt didn't move a muscle. So the temple is destroyed in 586 BCE. The people of Judea are largely exiled, but they're not spread out over the kingdom. They're kept together in mass in a couple of different places along the Tigris and Euphrates in Babylonia. And that's where we get the psalm, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, and when we remembered Zion. I'm going to stop and take questions in just a second. Okay. Now, the Hebrew Bible concludes, right, the very last verse of the book of Second Chronicles says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Persians had defeated the Babylonians. So the Babylonians are the ones that destroyed the temple and exiled the Judeans. Now they have been overthrown by the Persians. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word that the Lord had spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to rebuild a temple for him in Jerusalem, in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, Aliyah, right? You may go up to Jerusalem, and may the Lord their God be with them. So what's so interesting about this, not so much is that Cyrus said it, but that it's not the last book chronologically in the Hebrew Bible. But the editors who bookended the Hebrew Bible wanted to have that be the conclusion because that was their ideology. Their ideology was to get the Babylonian Judeans or the Judean Babylonians. Notice I'm not using the word Jewish. The Judeans who had been exiled to Babylonia to go back to Judea and rebuild the temple and reestablish not sovereignty because they were under the control of Persia, but to establish autonomy, right? Didn't really work. Most of the Judeans said, you know what, we've been here for 70 years, we're comfortable, we have our businesses, we have our families, I don't want to leave Nana, I don't want to leave Zadie, like we're going to stay here, thank you. So it was only a small group of young or ideologically committed Judeans who went back and they started rebuilding Judean society in the land of Judea. And then the history of the Middle East continues to overthrow and undermine and put on top different kingdoms. So the Persians, right, with King Cyrus, and then the Greeks with Alexander the Great, and then the Romans with Pompey, all of these different empire builders, if they wanted to go from Europe to Asia, or from Asia to Africa, or from Europe to Africa, you got to go through that little sliver of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, Israel, right? What we call Israel today, right? Okay. But what I want to emphasize is that there were many whole books written during the Greek period, like the book of Daniel, for instance, but they're set earlier in Babylonia, or they don't have any real narrative. They don't have a plot like the book of Proverbs. But the editor of the Hebrew Bible wanted them to be in the middle so that the final book of the Hebrew Bible was about coming back to the land of Judea. Okay, this is a place. Anybody have any questions before I move on to the next slide?
Mark has a question. He put it in chat.
Thank you. Can you read it?
The question is, when did the Israelites phase out the worship of Yud-Hey Vav-Hey and and God's cadre to the single God of Judaism?
Yahweh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the question I can answer. It was a very long process of going from polytheism to henotheism to monotheism. Okay, now I'm going to unpack that statement. It says in Psalm 82 that this one God, El, who is presiding over a council of gods, says to the gods, how long are you going to judge unjustly and unfairly? And by the end of that psalm, it seems as though that polytheistic setting has now been shifted so that there's one God, and those other gods have been demoted to mortals, but there are still other gods around for other people. So henotheism, or monolatry, is the worship of a single God, but it's not the denial of other gods. Yeah, I worship one God. Geh gesund. They have 1,000. Let them live and be healthy. The idea of monotheism doesn't come in at an elite level until the Babylonian exile, maybe, so the 6th century BCE, and it takes a long time for it to take root into the population, for it to go from a priestly elite theology in order for it to really have legs amongst the people. So the move from monolatry to monotheism takes hundreds of years. James.
When the idea of the Messiah, or is when the group that comes back to Judea from Persia?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, James. By the way, nice to meet you. I don't know that we've ever had a chance to learn together, so it's nice to meet you. So guess who is one of the people called Messiah? King Cyrus of Persia, right? Because what Messiah means is anointed. And the two offices for which one is anointed with oil is a king and a high priest. So you're talking about, I'm not actually sure what you're talking about, whether it's a military leader who's going to end up being a king or a high priest. But the idea of what I think you're asking is, when did we have this kind of messianic fervor and messianic speculation? And that was during the Greek and Roman period. So the book of Daniel is the closest thing in the Hebrew Bible that we have to an apocalypse, right? Kind of talking about the end of days. And that was written at around the time of the Maccabees, so 165 BCE. And that's where we really start to get this idea of the end times, that there's going to be a Messiah who may have some connection to God in terms of their power or their authority, but what will authenticate the Messiah's status is getting the invaders, whether they're Greeks or Romans, out of the land of Israel in order for the Judeans, notice not Jews, the Judeans to have political sovereignty in Judea. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Or are we moving on? All right. So Judah the Maccabee and his boys, right? They start us out in 168. They last about 100 years, right? The dynasty was corrupt for all kinds of reasons. It's a Hanukkah story. I'd love to come back to talk to you about it around Hanukkah. But in the year 63 CE, there was a civil war literally between brothers. And one of them invited the Roman general Pompey into the land of Judea to be on his side in the war. And it's like, you know, you don't invite Rome into your home and think that they're not going to overstay their welcome. And indeed, they overstayed their welcome for about 600 years. Okay. So that's how Rome got into the land of Israel. And at first they had these puppet kings, and then they had, they did that was like Herod. Herod the king was a puppet king of Rome. And then they had a direct kind of governor, a procurator, like Pontius Pilate was a procurator. And that was when there was this kind of messianic fervor to get the Romans out of Judea. So for those of you who know your New Testament, there is a scene where there is a herd of swine that Jesus exorcises their spirit, and they run off of a cliff and go into the water. So the name of the swine, or the name of the swineherd, is Legion, as in the Roman legion. And the idea of the swine is the only animal that looks kosher from the outside because it has split hooves, but it doesn't chew its cud. So it's the only animal that looks kosher but isn't, right? The Romans said they were there for our benefit. They weren't. And so they were pushed by Jesus. They were pushed out of the land and into the water, go back by water to Rome. So that's one of the parables in the New Testament the parable is explicitly anti-Roman, but it is written in literary language rather than a political manifesto. Okay. So this is why I have been emphasizing that I am speaking about the Judeans and not Jews, because we weren't really Judaism starts as a counterpart to Hellenism. I'm going to say that again. Judaism starts as a counterpart to Hellenism. So when you want to do Judean things because you have Judean roots, but you no longer live in Judea, you engage in Judaism. Who were the Romans crucifying? Jesus of Nazareth, Rex, the king of Israel, right? He was not the king of the Jews. He was the king of the or he was not crucified as the king of the Jews. He was the king of the Judeans, right? Yehudi at this point is probably not talking about a religious ideology. It's talking about our political identity, right? Jesus of Nazareth, the king of the Judeans. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because when we're talking about the people of Israel, Judaism doesn't become a religion the way that we use religion today to talk about Protestants and Catholics for a long time. Okay. So you've got the Great Revolt. You've got a lot of Jews killed. They tried to get rid of the Romans in 66. Estimates are up to 1 million Jews were killed or sold into slavery. Temple is destroyed in the year 69 by the Romans. the zealots who instigated the revolt against Rome, they made their way out of Jerusalem up to Masada, and they lasted at Masada until the year 74. But that didn't end the impulse to control the political destiny of the Judeans. So, as horrific as the Great Revolt was from 66 to 74, in 132, there was yet another rebellion against the Romans. And hell hath no fury like an empire scorned twice. This turned out to be a sea change. You would think that the destruction of the temple would have changed everything. Well, it changed a lot, but the second rebellion that took 3 years for the Romans to put down, that was Rome's cue to do something radically punitive. So unlike any other time where they had crushed a rebellion, what Rome did after the Bar Kokhba revolt was to change the name of the city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and to change the name of Judea to Syria Palestina. They chose the name of the Israelites' ancient enemies, the Philistines, to give to this land as a way to punish the Judeans for their uppityness. They were exiled from Judea. There is a common misperception that we were exiled from the land of Israel. We were not. We were exiled from the kingdom of Judah or Judea. And so many Jews went up and they lived in the Galilee, in the Golan, along the coast, or maybe they went to Babylonia, or maybe they went to Egypt. But the Jews did not leave what we today call the land of Israel. They were exiled, yes, but they were exiled from Judea, not from the northern kingdom that had been Israel. All right, there we go. Okay. So within 100 years, the Jews returned to Judea. And we've heard of Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Well, about 100 years after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews started to feel the benefits of being part of a large kingdom. Their economies were strong. They no longer had messianic pretensions. They weren't challenging Rome for military control. And their religious life flourished. So this is the time in the 3rd century when we get the Mishnah, and when we get the initial the Midrash Halacha, right? The Midrashim on the halachic parts of the Torah. So there had never been this kind of efflorescence of Jewish creativity in the land of Israel. I don't know about never, but for hundreds of years. And up until the Romans had their own economic challenges, Jews were Judeans who were living in Israel and Judah, right? So Jerusalem along the coast, not Tzfat, Sippori, Tiberias, Akko, and the Golan Heights, they were doing better than they had done in centuries. Okay. Here's an example of a shul's floor from the Galilee. And so let me read what Anne Kilbrew wrote, right? Following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 and the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem and much of Judea in the aftermath of the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, the majority of the Jews fled to Galilee. Palestine witnessed a marked increase in settlement intensity and economic prosperity during the late 2nd to 4th centuries. So the only thing I want to point out about the Mona Lisa of the Galilee is that she's a she and she's a person. And that tells you that as much as we rabbis like to think that the rabbis took over Judaism after the destruction of the temple, it can't be true entirely because the rabbis would not have allowed a picture of a woman on the floor in a shul. So we think that it was the priests, the descendants of the priests who were still Kohanim, who were still vying for power with this new group of Jews that emerged as leaders of the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? And so the rabbis and the priests are still duking it out in the land of Israel for hundreds of years. And you see evidence of that on the floors, on the mosaics of certain shuls, right? The zodiac, right? The rabbis recognized the influence of the stars. So Babylonia is the home of astrology. It says in the evening service, right before in the passages around the Shema, that God orders the constellations in their heavenly rotation. That means that the rabbis understood that the constellations influenced our behavior, but that God determined the heavenly rotations. So it's not that the heavenly rotations had their own independent, autonomous influence. It's that their influence came from God's ordering of the constellations in the cosmos. So when you get something like this, and you can see this sun god, right? So it's very much a syncretistic, right? It's kind of a blending of the different religious ideologies. Okay. Okay. Meanwhile, in Babylonia, you had more Jews joining the established Jewish communities. They've been established there for how long? 600 years, right? Most of the Jews who went to Babylonia after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, most of them stayed. So that means that some of the oldest, most stable, most populous communities in the world in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth centuries were in Babylonia. So those communities were also pretty stable up until the 5th century, and they produced the Babylonian Talmud, right? And that is much more authoritative than the Talmud that was produced in the land of Israel. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud, but it wasn't produced in Jerusalem. It was produced in Tiberias, the sages there. But they were looking, right? Why did they call it the Jerusalem Talmud? Because they wanted to go back to Jerusalem, right? That's where the temple should be rebuilt. That's where the Sanhedrin should sit. That's where they looked backwards for their model to be what would be in their future soon and in our days. Rome starts to spin out of control by 415. The kingdom had turned to heresy, which is how the rabbis described the kingdom becoming Christian. So Christianity becomes legal in 311, 313. It takes another 70 years for Christianity to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. So that's the 4th century. That's when Israel turns into, ready for this new term, the Holy Land, right? That's a Roman marketing tagline to promote pilgrimage from the Christian world from all over to come to see the holy sites in the Holy Land. And the Jewish community based in Tiberias was abolished in 415. And for the next 200 years, there are economic pressures that see the leveling off of Jewish growth, both economically and politically. Okay. Oh, okay. So this is where I think it gets very interesting. And for me, in my research, it was fascinating. So the land of Israel is conquered by Arabs, not Muslims yet, not Muslims yet, Arabs in 636. Over the next 4 years, the Arabs are Islamized. And that's when you have the buildings of the mosque on the Temple Mount. And that's really when the idea of the Islamic civilization from Spain to India becomes dominant. Um, so this is what I want to say now. Arabic becomes the dominant language in Palestine in the 7th century. So up until the 7th century, there was Hebrew, there was Aramaic, there was Greek, there was Latin, in being read. But part of the MO of colonizers, which is what the Arabs came as colonizers, settler colonialists, is to im impose their language and their culture on the natives. And their native language was Arabic. So this is what's fascinating. I hope that this is news to everybody. For 1,000 years, from the 7th century to the 17th century, more Jews spoke Arabic than any other language. And by the time you get to the year 1000, 80 to 90% of Jews lived in the Islamic Empire. They lived in the Muslim orbit. We Ashkenazi Jews are the vast majority of America. And so we tend to think that we were the vast majority of Jews. Not until the 17th century were there more Ashkenazim than people from the Arab world and Sephardim. Okay? I think that's amazing. Um, when the Islamic Caliphate changed hands, the Abbasid Empire in 762 decided to build a new city and have that be their capital, Baghdad. And the Jews were so close. So the Jews moved to Baghdad, and as many as 1 million Jews lived in Baghdad, and they were up to 10% of the population, right? So if somebody says, well, what was the New York City in the year 900? Oh, Baghdad, right? Lots of people from all over the world. They had interfaith dialogues, pretty peaceful. It's not what we think of today when we think of Islam. Okay, on the west side, the Moors crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar in 711, and they conquered Spain. They went up past the Pyrenees, actually, were turned back around 713. So the entire Iberian Peninsula is now Arab. So there weren't any passports. There weren't any travel restrictions. So once Spain becomes Arabized, all the Jews who live in the Arabic orbit can go to Spain without any residency hassles, right? ICE is not going to challenge the Judean or Jewish, at this point we can call them the Jewish presence on the Iberian Peninsula. And if there are economic opportunities, go west, young man, right? And take your wives. Your wives, because in Islam, you could have multiple wives. And indeed, Jews had multiple wives in the Arabic world, right? Up until the time they were flown to Israel in 1951, right? Many of the Arab Jews who came to Israel in 1951 had more than one wife. And the land of Israel, or the state of Israel, had to figure out what to do with them. Okay, we doing okay? All right. So one thing that's happened over the last 20 years is that we no longer talk about the Karaites as this heresy. The Karaites were a group that emerged to challenge the theology of the rabbis. They had a different philosophy of halakha. They had a different philosophy of law. And what Marina Rustow, who's at Princeton, who helped us understand this, what she says is that in every major Jewish city in the Arabic orbit, there were three different communities. There were Babylonian rabbinites, Judean rabbinites, meaning people who identified with the rabbinic tradition, and Karaites. Every good-sized community had at least three different shuls, two of which you would never step foot in. Okay. All right. Things were generally better in the Islamic world than in the Christian world. One more time. Arabs considered us monotheists. We were people of the book. We were protected by the Pact of Omar. Christians were as well, but Islam and Jews in the Arabic orbit both considered Christianity to be idolatry because of the deification of Jesus, the human being. Jews in the Ashkenazi world had to figure out how to negotiate that, and they did. But Jews in the Islamic orbit were treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't be too uppity, and when they did, they were massacred. And the first Jewish massacre in the Islamic orbit is in 1066 in southern Spain, in Granada. So this is actually, I think that if you know the history of the biography of Maimonides, it's a really interesting pivot. So Maimonides is born in Andalusia in 1138. In 1148, there's a new group of Muslims who conquer the old group of Muslims, and they tell the Jews in Cordova that they either have to convert to Islam or they'll be killed. Fleeing was the unstated option. But you can really mark the beginning of the contraction of Islam to 1138 in Spain. This new group is what we would identify as fundamentalists. They were not tolerant of other religions, and the openness that the Islamic civilization had to Greek ideas, to philosophy, to medicine, to algebra, all of that began contracting in the 12th century in the Islamic orbit. In the Christian orbit in Europe, the 12th century is really when anti-Semitism becomes a problem. So the Crusades begin in 1096. It's the 12th century where you have blood libels and desecration of the host libels. You begin the exiles from England in 1290, France and Germany. But what happens is that the Christians take on more and more territory in Spain. So as Christians take on more and more territory, they get more and more Jews. Because the Jews don't have to go anywhere, because the Christians are fighting against the Muslims and pushing the Muslims back to Africa, right? Not the Jews. And so this process of Christians reclaiming or claiming territory that includes Jews is part of the explanation for why there are more Jews in Christian Europe by the time we get to the 17th century, or the end of the 17th century, than there are in the Islamic orbit. I want to point out two things: that it wasn't always that Jews were being pushed out. We have two examples of Jews being invited, encouraged. In 1343, Poland's king, Casimir, he invites Western European Jews who are being persecuted to come to Poland. He says that you guys are great for the economy. And in 1492, when we're kicked out of Spain, the king of the Ottoman Empire sends ships to Spain to bring Jews to the Ottoman Empire. So that turns out to be really important because 30 years later, in 1517, the Ottoman Empire gets control of Palestine. And so once the Jews were in the Ottoman Empire, they made Aliyah. And so you see this uptick of Jewish presence in the land of Israel in the 16th century. And the city that explodes the most is Tzfat. And so you've got you've got not since the 3rd century in the land of Israel do you have this incredible blossoming of Jewish legal creativity, Jewish mystical creativity, Jewish poetic creativity, as you do from 1525 to 1575 in Sfat. And then the Ottoman Empire had a depression. So you know what they did? They took the wealthiest 5,000 families in Sfat and moved them to Cyprus to help the economy in Cyprus. And that completely decimated the Jewish community in Sfat. So even in the land where we were supposed to have some level of autonomy, we did not control our fate, and the Ottomans moved us out. Okay. Meanwhile, from the 16th century on, Jewish communities are being exiled from Central European states because of this new anti-Semitism stoked by Martin Luther and the Reformation. And so Jews are moving east. That's how we end up in Poland and in the Pale of Settlement in such great numbers. So we don't have exact numbers, but this is pretty close. In 100 years, from the end of the 18th century to 1900, Jews in the Pale of Settlement went from 350,000 to 5 million. We were poor. We didn't have political representation anywhere else except the Council of Four Notables in Poland, but they were Jewish. But that was where most of the Jews in Europe were congregated. And by the time we get to the 18th century, most of the Jews in the world are in Europe. Okay. All right, I think this is another good place to take a break. You'll notice the design of the slides has changed because now things are going to be totally different. So I wanted the difference to be represented and reflected in the slides as well. Okay, any questions before we go on to the next section?
Mark has a question.
Okay, Mark.
Okay. Was the evolving Israeli religious literary mythology eventually enshrined in the Hebrew Bible, inspired by the creation of the Mesopotamian cultural mythology, which served to memorialize Babylonian cultural identity? So did the Hebrew Bible is essentially a collection of mythology which served the purpose of providing a literary and cultural identity to Israelites returning back to Judea and Samaria.
So I would agree with you, but I don't like how you're saying simply.
Okay.
So take out the word simply and say it again, please.
Oh. Well, I was trying to draw a comparison between the Mesopotamian literary mythology and its effect on organizing and giving an identity to the Babylonian people as a template whereby Israelites returning to the land of Israel were going to create their own mythology for the purpose of establishing their religious and political identity.
Absolutely, and there's nothing simple or simply about it. That was my point. But I think you're absolutely right, Mark. So then you've got to look at the differences between the laws and the narratives, the myths. I mean, the myth is the right term. So let me just give you one example, and then Howard Merowitz, I'm going to go to you. So in the Babylonian myths, the image of God is the king, and only the king.
Mm-hmm.
In our myth, every single human being is the image of God. And so just like the God and the king are responsible for taking care of the subjects of the kingdom, one of the political messages of every person being in God's image and being an image of God is that we are all responsible for all of God's creatures because we are the ones who are in God's image. So it's a myth, but its political and religious differences
Mhm.
are tremendous. Are
All right,
tremendous.
so you're saying that the Hebrew Bible is filled up with mythology, but not historical events.
For sure, the Chumash, the first five books. If
Yeah.
you're asking me if there's history the way we understand history today, like a history book, we don't have any evidence of that.
Yeah.
We don't have any evidence of that. Howard,
Thank you.
Howard Mirowitz, you have to unmute, or I'm going to go on. 3, 2, 1, moving on. Edith,
Hello.
okay, hi.
Hi. Sorry about that. Let me turn my camera on too while I'm at it. My question, let me see if I can find my camera. I have so much trouble touching these things to make it turn on. Here
You're
we
not
go. Here
alone.
I am.
Nice to see you.
Okay. Hello. Good to see you. Been looking forward to this class. My question has to do with the exilarchs, the Reish Galuta in Persia, in Imperial Persia. I know there were the Reish Galuta, and I know, or I believe I know, that the Reish Galuta had been delegated by the Persian Empire, or whoever was in charge of it, basically full secular authority over the domestic affairs of the Jewish communities in Persia. What my question is one, when did that start? Was it before or after Cyrus dispatched?
Way, way, way after.
Okay, and I know it was active during the Talmudic period when the Gemara was written,
Yeah.
but the rabbis seem to think that most of the places that I've seen in the Talmud, I did study. I went through the whole of Shas in at least read it
Howard,
on
we're
a
running
daf
short on
yomi.
time, so I want to get to your question.
Okay, mostly in the Talmud, the rabbis kind of picture the Reish Galuta as a kind of Achashverosh type figure rather than a powerful secular authority, and don't really take that much cognizance of the role of the Reish Galuta in law, day-to-day law. And I'm wondering what was the Reish Galuta? How powerful were they, and how much of an influence did they have over what the Jewish community did in those years?
Yeah, so so the guy who could answer that question happens to also be named Shai. So his name is Shai Secunda, and he wrote a book called the Sasanian Talmud,
Mm.
because that's the name of the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Talmud. So he is right now one of the handful of historians who learned the language of Sasania Persia, and is reading those kinds of historical documents and can answer that question. I am almost entirely ignorant, so I'm going to pass. But
Oh, okay.
I will put in the chat notes his name and the name of the book. James.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, real quick question. During this whole time, were Jews allowed to own land in these Muslim countries? That's always been a big topic that Jews were not allowed to own land.
Yeah. So it depends on when and where. In general, Jews were able to own land in the Islamic countries. And in general, again, although there were exceptions, Jews were not allowed to own land in Christian lands. Okay. So things shift at the end of the 18th century. The first step toward what we're going to call emancipation is the Edict of Tolerance by the Holy Roman Empire Joseph II. This is not about recognizing Jews as human beings. That's the Enlightenment. That's the Emancipation. That's another 20 years. But the first step was to say, you know what? You guys shouldn't be an albatross around our neck. You guys shouldn't be a nation within our nation. We want you to contribute something to our nation state. And in order to do that, you need to know how to speak something other than Yiddish. And you need to stop looking so funny. And you need to get educated in languages and literatures and worldly subjects that will allow you to communicate with other people who aren't in your shtetl. So the language of civic amelioration describes the first generation or so of steps toward emancipation. What emancipation means is becoming emancipated, being free to be citizens. So the big challenge was Jews had been perceived as a nation. Right now we're perceived as a religion, but Jews had been always perceived as a nation. So how could you have one nation then join another nation? So this is what was asked by the Sanhedrin that Napoleon organized in 1806. But basically, Judaism becomes a religion beginning in the 19th century. And the idea of emancipation was that you would have a French Jew would have more in common with a French Catholic than a French Jew would have with a Polish Jew. That was the dream of emancipation. And that France as a government would treat the Jews the same as anybody else. The places where emancipation never took root were the Pale of Settlement, right, where most of us are from, our ancestors, and in the Arab world, right? We never were emancipated. We could never vote. We were never considered citizens. We were always dhimmi, right? The protected class. Okay. The book on how Judaism became a religion came out about 12 years ago. And she defines Jewish modernity as the dissolution of the political agency of the corporate Jewish community, meaning there's no more Jewish nation, and the shift of political agency to the individual Jew who became a citizen of the modern nation state. So somebody else said that emancipation was good for the Jews as individuals, but bad for the Jews as a people. That's another way to look at it. Meanwhile, back in the world of Islam, the reason why the Jewish population in Islam didn't keep up with the Jewish population in Christendom is because they did not keep pace with the scientific and medical advances that characterize Europe. They had depressions. They had, like, if you want to talk about the Dark Ages in Christianity, it was 500 years earlier than it was for Islam. It's not a bad way to think about it. So from the 15th century to the 19th century, Islam just didn't make all that much progress in many different fields. And so the Jewish population was flat. Sephardic refugee. Okay, so there's three different words. Ashkenazim, you know, Sephardic are people from Spain, but Arab Jews who spoke Arabic and had nothing to do with Spain, those are Mizrahi Jews. So the Mizrahi and the Sephardim Jews combined, their population probably equaled the Ashkenazi population around 1650. But as the Sephardic Jews who settled in the Ottoman Empire, as those parts of the Ottoman Empire were taken over by European countries, again, more Jews came under the jurisdiction of Christendom than Islam. So by 1900, that 80-20 split from the year 1000, where 80% of the Jews were in the Arab orbit and 20% of the Jews were in the Christian orbit, that was now reversed. I think that's spectacular. I mean, not spectacular isn't good, but it's like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that we had such a huge disparity between the Jewish presence in the Arab world and the Christian world and how that flipped. So I hope that you all learned at least that today. This black slide is the Holocaust. So 2/3 of European Jewry is wiped out. from 1942 to 1945. Arab Jews are basically safe. This is our current population distribution. So we've got more Jews in Israel than anywhere else. And the question then becomes for us, who are our people? So in 1807, it was argued for the first time explicitly in the best-selling Jewish book of the century that the commandment to love your neighbors yourself applied to Gentiles. And Rabbi Hurwitz from Sefer Abrit, the Book of the Covenant, said that the Talmud believed that loving your neighbors yourself meant the Gentile, and that Kabbalah also understood it that way. And Rabbi Hurwitz in Sefer Abrit is hard to dismiss. I don't think he's right historically, but that kind of embrace of the Gentile world and the Gentile neighbor began to characterize Orthodox streams in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. You already saw it begin in 13th century France. I said that the Arab Jews considered Christianity to be idolatry. That's true. But beginning in the 13th century, Ashkenazi Jews made a distinction between idolatry and partnership. And they said that all of those restrictions that are in the Talmud against idolaters should not be applied to Christians because they are restricted by religious practices. We worship the same God. We have an intellectual mistake. Oh, sorry, we have an intellectual disagreement. We think Christians are making an intellectual mistake, but it's not idolatry because they are restricted by conventions of religious morality. And what the Meiri says, again, in the 13th century, is that we need to treat contemporary Gentiles as fully equal to Jews in almost all respects. Again, the Meiri might not be a household name to you, but he was a significant figure in the Jewish intellectual world. So who are our people? And this is where I want to leave you. Not with a question, but with a piece of Talmud. You have all heard that all of Israel is responsible for one another. This is not news to anybody, I hope. But the context is that what it means to be responsible for one another is that we are responsible for protesting other Jews when they transgress Judaism. The only sense in which we are responsible for one another is not to redeem captives. Yes, we have to redeem captives, but that's not what this line means. This line is specifically about when other Jews misbehave, we're responsible for protesting their misbehavior. And the visual, and with that, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Marsha. This visual is how I think many of us feel about what's going on in Israel and what's going on with Jews in America, except that we're being squeezed not just from one side, but from both sides. And so it is on us as being responsible for the rest of the Jewish community to not only protest the other side, but to protest when our side gets it wrong as well. Thank you. Rabbi Marsha.
Yeah, thank you. So can you stop sharing, Shai? Is that possible? I just want to look at everybody. What first of all, I don't know if you kind of sort of were amazed, we got a tremendous amount of history today, which was probably some of this we've heard before in different classes. It's never, you can never learn it too much, and there's always what to glean, and of course setting us up for, you know, the Jewish life that we live today is a product of modernity, to be sure. I love this, Chai. Thank you. I want you to give a highlight of next week. Before I do, again, I want to say, So glad that all of you are here. And tell your friends about this wonderful class. We have 2 more weeks with Shai. I'll let you know our next scholar next week. Give us a highlight, Shai, about what's coming.
So this was about the people of Israel. Thank you, Mark. The next week is going to be about the land of Israel up until modernity. And then with Zionism, we'll talk about Zionism, but I also want to talk about Jewish understandings of the land, because the central mitzvah of the Torah is to live long on the land that the Lord your God is giving you. We now need to understand that land not as only the land of Israel, but as the entire earth.
And by the way, Mark, I do think that when Shai offers his class on Darwinism and biblical criticism, much of we'll really sort of get into some of the meat of the question that you specifically asked today, go deeper in there. There's just only so much we can cover in an hour and change. Anyway, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.